Hello, world history students. Today is a lecture on absolutism. This is Unit 8 and Part 3. You only have, it looks like, 4 EQs to deal with in this particular section of the unit. Really what absolutism is about monarchs or kings who were reacting to some crises that happened with the Protestant Reformation and wars of religion, who are trying to control everything within their borders. They want absolute power, and this is why it's called absolutism. What kings want to control in particular, due to this idea that they had the divine right to do so. In other words, God had given them the ability to be king, and God wanted them to rule for God who couldn't be there. Therefore, they had absolute power since God is backing them. But really what they wanted to control was their nobles. You might remember going back into earlier units that nobles or aristocrats were part of feudalism. The king relied upon them to govern and to collect taxes and to rule over peasants and serfs. Well, now kings want to control their nobles more than they had in the past. They don't want the nobles to be doing those things for them anymore. They also didn't want to have parliaments. Parliaments are groups of nobles generally who get together and tell the king whether he can go to war or whether he can collect taxes and so on. Well, nobles in parliaments are very annoying to kings. Kings want absolute control. They don't want to have to share power with a parliament, and so they don't want to usually call them to come into existence and parley or talk with the king. Kings also wanted to get more revenue. They wanted to control revenue, get as much as possible. That was through taxation or other means like making the economy run smoothly and then sort of getting some sort of fees and things from people who were working in the economy. The more revenue they could collect, the richer they were, the more they could spend on armies, which they could then use to take over territory, which was another thing that they wanted to control, more territory as much as possible. They also wanted to control religion a lot of the time. Still, at this point in time, people don't really believe in toleration of religious minorities, and the kings wanted to absolutely control everyone's faith. It's very difficult, of course, because the wars of religion had allowed a few Protestant groups, for example, to exist in Catholic countries, and some non-Anglicans to exist in England. Well, this is kind of a whole bunch of information on the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. These are two things that happen in the 17th century in England or in Britain. And basically what we had happening was King Charles of England, who ruled from about 1625 to 1649. King Charles wanted to be a very powerful monarch. He wanted to have absolute control over England. And he tried to rule without calling Parliament, without calling together people who could tell him whether he could tax and whether he could go to war and so on. So he just doesn't call them for a long period of time. That annoys the people who should be giving him advice and telling him what he can do in a parliament. He also wanted to push his religion, the Anglican religion, upon people who were not Anglican. And there are, non-Anglican people. There are the English Puritans. There are Scottish Presbyterians. Both of those groups are different kinds of Protestants who didn't really want to listen to Charles as the head of the Anglican Church. In fact, they're Calvinists. Now, Charles also wanted to collect revenue, and he was trying all sorts of different ways of doing it. He couldn't raise taxes directly because English tradition said that Parliament had to say yes. And so he was trying all of these sneaky ways of collecting revenue, and he's just really making rich people mad. Well, finally, he kind of oversteps his bounds, and the Parliament that he called into session finally because he was going to go to war with the Scots, the Parliament said, just wait a second, and tried to reduce his power. He and the Parliament go to war with one another. This is the English Civil War. The parliamentarian side is called the Roundheads, and the King's side is called the Cavaliers. They fight for a number of years. You can see 1642 to 1649. King Charles and his Cavaliers are defeated by Oliver Cromwell's new model army and his side, the Roundheads. Well, the leader of the Roundheads, this Oliver Cromwell, got tired of dealing with Charles. Charles didn't seem to be willing to be a non-absolute king, and eventually Oliver Cromwell does the kind of unthinkable. He tries the king for treason against his own country and executes him by chopping his head off. You can see that in the image there to the right. It was really quite shocking. Could a king commit treason against his own country? Oliver Cromwell thinks that he could, and so this is a regicide, or the killing of a king. Well, Oliver Cromwell rules for a little while, and then the Parliament invites Charles I's son to come and rule. One of his sons who's ruling, this guy James II, started act like his dad, started act like Charles I, not calling Parliament, trying to force his way religiously and collect revenue without asking Parliament. The Parliament wasn't going to have another civil war, so they decided to chase this guy James off of the throne and invite his sister or his daughter and his brother-in-law to come and be the new king. This is William and Mary. William and Mary agreed with the Parliament to be constitutional monarchs. They don't want to have absolute power. They established a Bill of Rights, and you get a more modern kind of happy, glorious political revolution that happens, where rich people and influential people are helping the constitutional monarchs rule from here on out in England. Now, having a constitutional monarchy at this point in time is pretty rare. In other places, like in Russia and in France, you had absolute monarchs. Mentioning Russia, the leader of Russia is a czar there. Czar is kind of a word for emperor, a Russian word for emperor. And the czar who had the most absolute power is Peter the Great. Peter the Great rules a little bit later than Charles or his son James in England. He rules from 1689 to 1725. Now, Russia is, for all of its history, really kind of behind where everyone else is in Europe. They're a little bit more backward. And Peter the Great decided that if Russia was going to be a great country and compete with other European countries, that it had to modernize, it had to get with the times. And so he tries to get the Russians to westernize. He changes the way that they dress. He changes the position of women in society, allowing them for the first time to sort of socialize together with men. He pushed for education. He hears about the potato and thinks that would be a great crop for his poor people to eat. So he introduces the potato to Russia, and he also creates a very large army and navy. He doesn't free the Russian people from serfdom. The Russian peasants are serfs, so they are more or less owned by noble people. This works out for the Russians for a really long period of time. In fact, they won't get rid of serfdom until about 1861 or so. Now, Peter is a very powerful absolute monarch. He controls the nobility. He makes them be in his army or makes them be in his government and serve him. There is no parliament to speak of in Russia all the way up until the 20th century, fairly modern times. He collects whatever taxes he wants to, but it's kind of hard to collect taxes in Russia because the economy is pretty backwards too. And he also controls religion. They aren't Catholic. There is no pope. They are Christians who are Orthodox, and essentially the Tsar is kind of in charge of that religion too. So it's kind of like being in England, where the ruler of the country is also kind of the head of the church of the country. Well, he also creates a town, or a city, his new capital city, which is named after him, really, in a way. It's called St. Petersburg. And it is not where Moscow is. Moscow was the former capital and will be the capital again. Moscow's kind of deeper in Russia. St. Petersburg is on the Baltic Sea. It's a kind of window on Western Europe. And to get to St. Petersburg by ship, or to go from St. Petersburg to the rest of Europe, is really quite easy. Once again, showing that he wants Russian people to become more modern and to become more Western. This works out really well for him. Russia does become a much more modern European-style state because of Peter the Great's absolutism. Another absolute ruler, perhaps the most absolute ruler that you have, is Louis XIV of France, who rules or reigns from about 1643 to 1720, a really long period of time. He calls himself the Sun King because, like the sun, he's the center of things, and everyone else just sort of rotates around him and views him as the brightest object, that there is. He also has this quote of, "I am the state." He couldn't be tried for treason because he is the state. If anyone were ever to defeat him in a civil war and try to try him for treason, he claims to be France. France is more or less his property in a way, if you think about it that way. There is a parliament that never gets called. He doesn't ever call the parliament. He doesn't have to deal with rich people telling him what to do, telling him he can't collect taxes and so on. In fact, he more or less controls the nobility, not by creating a whole city like Peter the Great did, but by creating this wonderful palace called Versailles. You can see it at the right there. The Palace of Versailles is a place where thousands of very powerful and rich nobles come. They have to come and live with him at Versailles. He keeps them entertained. He keeps them very busy so they can't plot against him, and he controls them completely. He also keeps them from, going into a parliament and telling them what to do. He wants religious control, and so he kicked all of the Calvinists out of France one year. The Calvinists had won the ability to practice their religion because of a French war of religion. 100 years later, Louis says, "Nah, I don't like that agreement. I want complete control. I want everyone to listen to me and be my religion," which was Catholic. He also taxed quite a bit. He had to tax a lot because he had this gigantic army and he went to war all of the time. So he taxed without anyone telling him that he couldn't. He also was using that policy of mercantilism that we talked about before in the last unit, where the mother country is trying to profit from having all of these colonies all over the place, but mercantilism is also about the king getting as much gold and silver into his treasury as possible, and that works out pretty well for Louis because, as I said, Louis was spending a lot of money on his army and not really completely successful. You can tell that he took over bits and pieces of territory, but really nothing spectacular like you'll see happening later in this unit with a guy named Napoleon. So we have a very well, we don't have an absolute monarchy in England because of the English Civil War. We do have an absolute monarchy in Russia because Peter the Great is a very powerful monarch. We have an absolute monarchy in France because of Louis XIV. In Germany, or what would be Germany, there is not an absolute monarchy. And it's because of the last war of religion, this 30 Years' War. It was, once again, a war of religion between Catholics and Protestants, and the Holy Roman Emperor, who would be, we say Holy Roman, but really we're talking about Germany, who should be like the German emperor. He wanted to have absolutism. He wanted to control a parliament. He wanted to collect taxes and all that kind of stuff. But a war breaks out, and his forces, the imperial Catholic forces, were fighting against German and a whole bunch of international countries, most of them Protestant, but not all of them. This is a really nasty fight that lasts for about 30 years. The Holy Roman Empire, or Germany, loses about a quarter of its population. About 6 million people die. And in the end, well, the emperor is defeated. And there is then no imperial absolutism. There is no Germany. There is no German emperor until relatively recently, like 1871. And in fact, religious toleration is the rule. Both Catholics and Protestants can be free to believe what they want to believe. There was, in fact, a parliament that oftentimes told the Holy Roman Emperor, this German guy, that he couldn't collect taxes. There were no taxes. There was no one army. And so once again, no absolutism for a would-be Germany. Well, I hope I gave you enough information to do your 3 or 4 EQs. I encourage you to take the quiz or lecture check. Thanks so much.